Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the discussion on our screening of Plant This, just a movie that's focused on the international movement in urban agriculture. I'm Dora Muhammad, Congregation Engagement Director at the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. I also am the Health Equity Program Manager, and this is where this policy emerges from. It became a priority as a result of the pandemic. And so tonight we'll be focusing on solutions here in our region. And I'm very, very happy to be joined by just two just really dynamic leaders in this space. So we have Duron Chavis with us. He is the founder, and please correct me because he does so much, so I know I'm going to miss a few things. But he's the founder of the Happily Natural Festival that occurs in the summer. The day then it now has turned into a movement. He runs the nonprofit Happily Natural Urban Agriculture and Resilience Garden Project. Did I get that right?
It's just Happily Natural Day, beloved.
Very good. And then we have Namita Money as well. Lovely, lovely, just wise. She is the coordinator of the Black Church Supported Agriculture Program that's run by the Black Church Food Security Network. It is a national network, but she works out of the DMV region. And so very, very, again, happy to be with you all this evening. I'm going to lay a few things out before we delve into the conversation. One, I want to apologize for my voice. I generally don't like drinking during these recorded events, but you will see me sipping water so I can keep my voice, hopefully, throughout the whole discussion. But I mentioned at the start, oh, and also I want to thank our comms director at the center, Aisha Taylor. She'll be managing Facebook Live. So if you have questions, you can drop it on Facebook, or she's also monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, you can drop it there as well. And she will tap me and let me know. So let's get to it. So because of the pandemic last year, the administration in Virginia distributed a report called the Virginia Roadmap to End Hunger. And so that really elevated this on our priority list for our members, a lot of our congregations in our health equity work. So we come to it in that space, although there are different intersections, as you saw in the film, dealing with environmental justice. We'll talk about some of the racial justice, but there's a lot of ecological and issues. And so just wanted to give you all the angle, sort of where we connect at the center. This is our first time delving into this subject, so this is our first conversation. So there will be more following this. I do want you to bear that in mind. There's so many layers and dimensions to this. We will be supporting the church network in terms of getting more Virginia congregations involved and connected and supported, and we'll talk about that. And I already told Duron I'm going to be like a stalker because his work is so innovative. I want to begin telling that story so that we know how to support and get involved and really replicate it. And even though he is Richmond based, he has shared his wisdom and his experience throughout the Commonwealth. So he is not selfish with his wisdom. So again, thank you both. So with that, I wanted to just sort of, the very first conversation we had, you all helped me with my language and framing the issue. And so in the movie, they talked about the cultural shift from canning, where you produce your own food, to sort of really becoming lazy, if you will, and out of the convenience of. And so I wanted you both to talk about two things that you all brought up. So with Duron, you said to me, there's no such thing as a food desert. I want you to tell people why you say that and why you educated me on that.
Oh, thank you. So, I feel like it's often a problem where we're asking kind of the wrong question, right? In our context, in the Americas and as well as global, whether you're urban and rural, we have this definition of areas that don't have access to healthy food. And we call them food deserts, but the definition, is areas that don't have access to a grocery store within 30 miles, within a mile or more of the residence. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what did people do before grocery stores existed? And the documentary highlighted that we're only about 50, 60 years into having a grocery store as a modern convenience. So my question has been, when people ask me about food deserts, so well, what do people do before there was a grocery store?
Mm-hmm.
And the honest response to that is that people grew their food hyper locally, relied upon networks of expertise within their local community. Farmers were really accented as a really important aspect of communities in both rural contexts as well as urban contexts. So that plus the reality of this conversation about food deserts usually centering around urban communities, we have to kind of ask, well, what happened in communities that they wouldn't have a grocery store, right? And deepening an understanding about the racial history of policy and discriminatory policies that have been placed upon communities of color in cities and rural areas. Then we understand that these were decisions that were made that would create lack of investment and concentrated poverty in both rural communities as well as urban communities, and that's how we end up with lack of food access in these neighborhoods. The bigger conversation and the point that I'm gonna just take it home with, what we really have is a set of policies that prohibit communities from having access to healthy food, and these are policies that run the gambit from land use policies to investment policies. When I say investment policies, I'm speaking explicitly towards redlining and the creation of the highway, interstate highway systems that basically targeted communities of color and prohibited them from investment. So, that's kind of like we got to walk backwards into the conversation in order to really understand why these communities don't have access to healthy food. Hence why I say there's no such thing as a food desert. I mean, a desert is a natural phenomenon.
Right.
The context of a desert, people often say, well, it's devoid of life, but that's not even true. I mean, deserts have entire ecosystems that have adapted to those conditions, right? And deserts serve a purpose on the planet. So when we say that these areas are food deserts, we're kind of doing a disservice to the actual reality of deserts on our planet, right? And we're dodging the fact that these were intentional decisions that were made that created these areas that don't have access to healthy food. And then it also helps us shirk responsibility in terms of what we can do to change policy, and then also change our practice and what we do as consumers, as well as producers, institutional leaders, and just regular everyday people, how we can regenerate our neighborhoods and our communities, our cities, so that everyone has access to healthy food and everyone has the skills and talents and knowledge and abilities and resources to make their communities more resilient.
Like I said, lots of layers, people. So before I go to Namita, I wanted you to talk about just briefly, like some of the things specific to the pandemic that you all had did, just so people get an idea of sort of the general work that you all do, and sort of how you stepped into this space because of the increased food insecurity due to the impact, sort of exacerbating, like you said, things that already existed that really people did not understand how intentional it was unless you lived it. So I just wanted you to touch on it briefly before we go to the programs that the security network has.
Well, my organization, I'll just say we've been doing this food work for a long time prior to COVID. We've been invested in regenerating locally owned and controlled food systems for communities of color throughout the city of Richmond, throughout the region, really. Our work started in distribution, working with Black farmers, connecting those Black farmers to areas that have been designated as food deserts, connecting them through pop-up farmers markets, and it evolved into the development of community gardens, urban farms, orchards, and that's our work today. We do a lot of production work. We do a lot of development of public green space with an accent on food justice and climate resiliency. But our trainings and the work that we do in advocacy is really about how do we accentuate the need for community control of food systems. And when I say food systems, I mean the production, I mean the aggregation, I mean the distribution, I mean the processing and the waste management of food. These are all things that are happening every day around us, and our communities are locked out of those systems. We have little to no ownership across those different platforms that allow people to eat. And so my goal, the goal of our organization is to get people. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, well, that's our work.
I got you. I got you. You tease it. That's a teaser. There's some deep work we're going to get into. Namita, I want to go to you. So first of all, you frame these issues as food apartheid. So I wanted you to delve into that, sort of the thoughts behind that so people understand your framing. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just building off of what Duron just said, food apartheid is a more useful word than a food desert, because a food desert would imply that it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. But when we think about what is actually happening in communities where there isn't access to fresh food, it's not about just inserting a grocery store. It's about looking at the whole system that's there, the deep racism in the zoning, the public health crisis, the environmental racism, and the lack of connection to the land that really hinders and creates this whole system where people don't have control over the types of foods that they're getting.
This is good, very, very good. And now I want you to talk about sort of your work. So I know that there's, like Duron, you have been doing this work, the Black Church Food Security Network. So didn't you all just didn't appear because of COVID, but I think the value became more aware, more prescient for people. And so I want you to talk about a few of the programs that you currently do, and then sort of how the pivot that was made to create the program that you are now the coordinator.
Sure, yeah. So the programs that we had in place pre-pandemic were really, so what we do is we partner with Black churches across the country, and we help them use the vast amounts of land that they have to create community gardens. And we also use their space to have Black farmers markets. And we created this program because the Black churches are the largest landowning body in Black America, and we wanted to recognize and use the assets and understand the history of the Black churches in really being an incredibly strong force in both activism, food sovereignty, like in so many different ways. So honoring that legacy, we created these programs to really just use the assets that were already in place in the Black community. Because of the pandemic, we sort of pivoted to add another program where we are helping connect Black farmers to Black church communities through partnering with congregations, their food-related ministries, and food distributions, so that rather than relying on large food banks, the USDA corporate donations, we can help churches actually buy directly from the Black farmers, who in so many ways aren't being supported by the corporations and the government agencies.
So you touched on something that I kind of want to delve into, just to lay groundwork on really the racist barriers that have existed and why there's even an emphasis on Black communities and brown communities. And that's with the USDA. And so I wanted you to talk about the Black Farmers Justice Act that you all are involved in advocating. I don't know, Aisha, if you can drop some of the links to the articles that I pulled for everyone in the chat on sort of where the status of that goes, but just talk about, because I think it's important when we talk about dismantling racism for people to understand how racism shows up in the food system, because then touches on what Duron was alluding to towards the end of his remarks. So talk about the Justice Act for farmers, Black farmers.
Yeah, so we are really excited to be helping work on the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which the main goal is to end the racism and discrimination within the USDA. So it does that in a couple different ways, by providing debt relief and access to land and credit for Black farmers, helping provide land grants to create new generations of Black farmers and restore the land base that has been lost, and protecting like remaining Black farmers from losing the land. So there's actually a deep history of land loss in the Black farming community because of the USDA. And so with this act, we're hoping to revert some of the issues related to that, and address that deep and the deep history of racism.
Duron, do you want to go into some of that history? You want to break
Yeah.
that?
So, all right. The deal is this, right? And I appreciated the documentary, but it did totally gloss over.
It didn't even mention it.
So there's two things happening, right? There's the industrialization of our food system, right? That has been happening for the last 50, 60 years, right? But at the same time, we have had, this country is built on, agriculture as an industry. And as an industry, agriculture in this country was really prototypically a white male run endeavor, right? Black people, brown people were used as labor to build the wealth of these white land grabbers. I hate to say owners because it kind of erases the fact that the land in this country was stolen from indigenous people, right? And when I say stolen, I mean it was our common, the way that we're taught history is as if there was no body on the land, there was no people here, and that somebody came and laid a claim, and then they started doing things on the land. But what we know is that there indigenous people lived throughout the United States, right? And had indigenous farming practices. I don't want to go on a tangent, but I just want to say this is how confusing living in America is because on one hand, they'll tell you, well, pilgrims came to the United States, or colonists came to the United States in Jamestown, and they were starving, and they had to learn how to grow food from indigenous people. But then at the same time, in the same breath, they'd tell you that these indigenous people didn't have culture and didn't have a civilization. So how do you learn how to grow food from people who don't have a civilization? So what we're seeing happen now, or what has happened now in relationship to the the Black Farmer Justice Act is a result of folks advocating for restorative and reparative justice to be done to Black farmers explicitly who were discriminated against by the USDA, denied loans and access to programs that was offered to white farmers throughout the country, right? So I think under Barack Obama, the largest class action suit, the Pickford versus Glickman case, paid out billions of dollars to some farmers who were able to get to be a part of that class action suit that had been discriminated against by the USDA, who had applied for loans and had been denied due to racism, right? Which had resulted in loss of land, right? Had resulted in loss of profits and business.
Another form of land grabbing.
Right, which was another form of land grabbing. But then, those farmers, they were offered debt relief, right? And so they were either able to get a payout or get debt relief, right? And some farmers took the payout. Some farmers took the debt relief. This current act is designed to remedy the fact that many of those farmers still hadn't received any remedy for the discrimination that they had faced years before. So it's important to be clear that the plight of Black farmers is dire. Mm-hmm. It's almost 90% in terms of land loss from the early 1900s to today, right? And that land loss has affected communities intergenerationally, right? Mm-hmm. Now, while farming is considered, a really arduous task, we're seeing so many people come back to the space to try to be farmers, that want to enter into the work. But if you're an African American who doesn't have ties to the land in terms of family that has land ownership, or you may be a generation or two removed from someone who has had their land lost as a result of these discriminatory practices, you're kind of not a part of this, land, this Justice Act, so to speak. I mean, there is some provisions that are talking about making grants for land for people who have been traditionally marginalized from the system. But 98% of rural land is still owned by predominantly white people, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens is that communities of color are trying to get into the work, but they don't have the connections in terms of resources. And when I say resources, I mean land, and then also equipment, also familiarity due to having family that has been actively farming for generations. So what's important for folks to understand is that documentaries like this, while they talk about sustainable agriculture and the need for revitalization of our food systems, without a lens that explicitly grounds us in the racially discriminatory history that the United States has had towards people of color in this country, it's kind of like you're dismissing like an entire piece of the history of why our food system is broken in the first place, right?
It goes back to what you were saying, how it relieves them from being accountable to address it. Because if I don't speak about it, you won't know about it, and you won't ask me about making it right.
Right. So it's a whole factor that needs to be brought into the work.
I mean, we're here tonight. So. Right. But this is the key. So everyone, why I wanted to lay that foundation is so that then you'll understand the value of what these two organizations bring as a solution to this. So I want to delve into that. So first, Namita. So wait, in addition, I didn't do this plug. I'll do the plug at the end as well. But the network has Faith, Food, and Freedom summer campaign to support Black farmers. Again, definitely the purpose of our work at the Center for Health Equity is the intersection of health and justice. And so this work cannot exist unless we use the racial equity lens for our work. So I wanted you to just talk about that campaign to support Black farmers that you are doing this summer as sort of one of the anchors to elevate the plight of Black farmers and the need to support them.
Yeah, thanks so much for uplifting that, Dora. So our campaign just started on Juneteenth, and we are running till October. And one of the main goals is to provide support to Black farmers. We also are working to expand our network of Black churches. So working to support in both areas so that we can really work more to create a system where we are getting food directly from our Black farmers and not having to rely on industrial and governmental sectors. And so our campaign is running till October, and we would really appreciate all of the support. We are also working to uplift different Black farmers in our community on social media. So if y'all want to follow the campaign, you can through our Instagram and our Facebook page.
Excellent, excellent. And then now, Duron, this I definitely want, I think there's a question even about it. People are aware of the property and the work that you all are doing. Um, I want you to talk about that unique innovative program that you have about land tenure and land ownership and what you all are doing to address that.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you. So I've been involved in urban ag, like the growing part since 2012. We've been involved in the food system work since at least 2008. When we got involved in the production side or the development of community gardens and urban farms, one of the biggest challenges that we experienced was lack of land tenure. So what land tenure means is that, your ability to stay on a piece of property and really work to develop it into a productive farm. Uh, Having a space and turning it into a garden is not an easy process. It does take some resources and it takes time and sweat equity. Having a space for 2 years, 3 years is really not sufficient in terms of really turning it into a productive space. As what I learned the hard way is that if you don't have some form of ownership of the property or an agreement that's longitudinal with an organization to use the property, you put yourself in a very precarious position developing a farm or a garden on that space. And our history has been one where we developed large scale endeavors on properties that were owned by, developers who then, after the property had been in function for like 2, maybe 3 years, decided that they wanted to do something else. And so that meant that all of the thousands of dollars and hours that we had invested in that space was now nixed. So our work now in this space of urban agriculture centers and is grounded in how do we create opportunities for longitudinal land tenure, i.e. land justice for communities that want to farm, right? So what that work looks like for me right now is I serve on the board for the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, as well as the board for the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons. So these are two different community land trusts that exist in our region that are dedicated to, on the Maggie Walker side, affordable housing, and then their secondary focus is public green space. And then the Central Virginia Agrarian Commons is dedicated to the acquisition of land explicitly for use by Black and Brown farmers to use as food system stakeholders. By virtue of the land trust taking ownership of land, what that allows is for a farmer to have a long-term lease, 20 years, right? Because it takes at least 5 for a farmer to get the land, to learn the land and get the soil correct, especially in an urban context, so that the farm can be productive. So providing that farmer with at least a 10 to 20 year lease for them to really build out the infrastructure, learn the land, build up the soil fertility, and then develop the systems, supply chains that are necessary for their farm to be productive is really the next level of work that needs to be done. And the video didn't really talk about this, but this is one of the real challenges that all urban agriculture faces, especially in the face of lack of affordable housing, especially in the face of gentrification, right? Because as developers come and identify vacant, blighted lots in communities, their goal is to purchase those properties and turn them into homes or apartments or condos so that they can turn a profit, right? So in most neighborhoods where the land is affordable, right, these are predominantly Black or Brown or formerly Black or Brown communities or transitioning communities that once were Black or Brown that are now becoming more predominantly white as a result of gentrification. What you find is that most communities that were formerly redlined are the same communities with an abundance of abandoned and blighted vacant properties or tax delinquent properties. So those are targeted by developers for, their machinations. It's just a part of the system that we live in.
Let me put a footnote here. I was reading up on this. There was a case of a collective in LA. I believe it was LA. It was in California, definitely. They had South Central LA. They had a growing farm, and a developer came in and said they wanted to develop land. It's almost like that when you talk about sort of the system that really is intentional against having Black communities advance. They purchased the land and say they wanted to develop it. They bulldozed the farm, and that land to this day still hasn't been developed on.
Right.
So they did that. They destroyed this farm that was thriving and displaced these farmers and the locally owned food economy. And I think that's just key in this conversation. I just wanted to add that footnote.
Yeah, and it's not just here. The video talked about what happened in Shanghai with the farmer in Shanghai. Right. I mean, this is just a byproduct of what land. Nobody's making any more land.
That's
okay.
Right.
So land is a finite resource, and so the control of land is really it's a question of power and who has who has it and who doesn't. So the community land trust serves as a tool that communities then control the land, right? A nonprofit organization has a board, has community representation. People that are from the community play a role in determining what happens on that land. And in that sense, the idea of a community land trust in and of itself has its origins in Black civil rights struggle. Shirley Sherrod and her husband Charles Sherrod with New Communities Inc. back in the 60s, they were organizers for SNCC. And so their work around getting farmers registered to vote in Georgia evolved after the Civil Rights Acts passed. They stayed in Georgia and worked to develop property or purchase property that would allow farmers to have a place to build homes on, as well as land to farm. And so that was 60 years ago, and they're still in existence doing the same work today, really trying to secure space for folks to have liberation or independence or self-sustainability, self-sufficiency, self-determination. And I think that's the overarching kind of clause that we're talking about. While that's not dismissing the ecological benefits and the environmental benefits, you know what I mean, or the economic benefits. That's just saying that at the core of this stuff is really trying to the work of justice in this is how do we secure land and put it in a position so that the communities can have a determination in terms of what happens on this. So that's the work we're doing now. We're working in we're the land trust. Maggie Walker is purchasing 9 acres in Chesterfield, on the border of Chesterfield, Richmond, off of Jefferson Davis Turnpike, to build what is called an agrihood, where homes will be sold. The land trust will keep the ownership of the land, but sell the actual above ground house to individuals as a first-time home buyer kind of entry point. Our organization, Happily Natural, will manage the farm that will then sell the produce to the folks that live in the subdivision, right? As kind of like a HOA fee, for example. People pay a HOA fee. So the folks that live in that neighborhood, as a part of their HOA fee, they'll be paying into getting weekly produce from the farm. Okay. And so that community land trust work is really important to me, and I think it's important to this conversation as to how do we secure land tenure for Black and brown farmers so that they can enter into the work, but then also how do we solve for affordable housing at the same time.
No, that's powerful, very, very powerful. And I want to pull Namita in into when we talk about and I thank you for bringing up the history of the Sherrods and sort of, again, this idea of self-determination and empowering communities is key. And so I want to hit on it in a couple of ways, but Namita, I wanted you to talk about the language that you use in terms of, as your approach to this work is about growing the assets of the community, and how important that is in this space. My thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the work we do is rooted in the Black church because there are so many assets. So we're working in a model that's asset-based rather than in a sort of charity mindset that most nonprofits work in, where you're extremely reliant on grants and funding outside. And because of that, like there are only certain ways that you're allowed to work within the system. And it's usually not creating much real change because what's funding the project is, you know, part of the system. So by using the assets of the Black churches, we're able to really create the solutions that are community based and that need to be seen. And what another thing is that when you rely on a charity-based model, usually it's not very sustainable long term. And that's because the money is coming from outside, the resources is coming from outside. So once that stops, you can no longer have those same things that were being inputted. So for example, when there's reliance on like corporate donations and food banks, that's all coming from really large scale farms and really, and you know, like the USDA that has this history of racism. And we know it's not coming from the Black farmers because the types of farmers that are growing at such a large scale and that are profiting are the white farmers, and they're putting profit over people. So really, when we're able to use the assets of the community that's already there, then we can sort of put that model on its head.
And talk about the small farmers as being the solution. And by small, I think you all referenced, Antonio, you're talking about like 20 acres. And but again, in contrast to the big farms you mentioned, talk about the dynamic of that paradigm of a network of small farmers.
Yeah, so small farmers in a lot of ways are the future of food. And that's because the way that they grow food is generally more ecologically sound. They're also working within communities and able to respond faster when there are changing needs due to climate change and due to the types of food that they want to be growing. They practice more. They practice more equitable practices in terms of farm labor, and the way that they're growing is it's in more harmony because they're able to grow with more diversity. So when they're growing at such a large scale with large farmers, they're usually only growing one crop, and when a disease hits, you know, it hits the whole farm, and because there isn't a lot of diversity, then the resilience is greatly reduced. And in that way, small farmers can really pivot really fast when there are issues related to disease and pests and all these things that are going to be cropping up more and more because of climate change. Yeah, we really have to rely on small farmers.
No, it's excellent. And so before I toss the last question to Duron, I did pull a definition of resilience. It's interesting. I was, working on framing our discussion last year because of COVID. I did a series called Faith and Resilience, and so it was 6 video chats from the faith perspective, but it was dealing more of the personal of resilience, dealing with the pandemic. But got this definition from John Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. So as we're thinking of communities and what we're facing, not just, again, the pandemic, but these larger issues, this historic racial discrimination that has marginalized Black farmers and communities of color. And so they have the definition: it's a positive adaptation in the face of adversity to prepare for, withstand, and recover from a disruption. And so I was thinking about something that was really, really powerful that you said, Namita, when we were preparing for today. And you were saying how one thing that you all are conscious of is coming into this space, but not doing it as a colonizer. So again, it just talks, to me, that said a lot, in terms of the approach. And so I wanted to close with something that honestly I was educated on that Duron shared as we prepared. And this is what I mean. I'm glad that we're doing these conversations at the center, because we may think we understand an issue, but those who are actually in this work, leading this work, we have a lot to learn. And so again, I thank the both of you for teaching me as we prepared for this conversation. And one of the key things that Duron taught me was about how food banks actually destabilize the community's food security. That was very profound, and I want you to share that because as a faith-based organization, we're constantly trying to shift people into the space of justice away from the beneficence, like of doing charitable work. And of course, we think food banks. Why wouldn't you? What's wrong with food banks? Tell us and teach us right now, Duron.
So there's a metaphor that me and a couple comrades have been like tossing around. So the thing is like the way that this is a story. So I want you to imagine there's a river, right? And we're gathered at the downstream part of the river, right? And then all of a sudden, like one day, just weird day, like there's babies, right? Coming downstream in the river, right? Like somebody's dropped babies in the river. The babies are drowning. So our first instinct, right, is like, yo, let's get the babies out of the river, right? Like just save the babies, right? The saving of the babies is the food bank. But it's important for us to take a moment and think, who the hell is throwing babies in the river in the first place, right? Okay. So the real work is stopping whoever at the top upstream
the root of the problem
is tossing the babies in the river. We got to stop the babies being dropped in the river in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. So our system, like nonprofits, the nonprofit industrial complex, lives in a space of funding the people that are saving the babies from out of the river, right? The challenge that philanthropy has, right, is how do we get to the root causes and how do we fund the change that will stop the inequity from happening in the first place. So in the case of food bank, the food bank is typically, in our case, in Virginia, in Richmond in particular, is Feed More. It's one of the largest nonprofits in our nonprofit ecosystem. They get all the money. When it comes down to talking about hunger, they're the first person that gets called when it comes to corporate funding, when it comes to philanthropic funding, when it comes to just everybody day to day, that every man is like, yo, I'm going to give some money to the food bank, right? Mm-hmm. What the problem with that is that while all the resources are being sucked up by the feed mores of our country, very few philanthropic foundations and corporate foundations are interested in putting money into stopping people from being hungry in the first place, right? And so that kind of work, the work of building resilient food systems, the work of building community gardens, urban farms, creating affordable housing, building economic development for community members, like all the things that created the lack of healthy food in communities and the fact that people have to even go to the food bank in the first place is not sexy, right? It's complicated work. It requires orientation towards racial justice that many of us lack and very few of us understand, right? It requires us to work with communities instead of doing for communities. And that's a paradigm shift that's very complicated, but it requires vulnerability. It requires authenticity. It requires you to build relationships with the people who are supposedly like the recipients of the services. That's a big work. That's not just like, oh, I'm gonna just drop off some veggies at the food bank, right? That's not just I'm gonna throw some money in the pot. So that's the type of stuff that I'm talking about when I say the food bank destabilizes, the radical work of stopping hunger, because they're not interested in stopping hunger. Mm-hmm. They make a lot of money by people being hungry, like the CEOs and the staff. That's job security. As long as people are hungry, then these people have a job. And it's not saying that they're doing bad work, because there is a requirement for somebody to save the babies out of the river, right? Like that has to happen. But the reality is like, if those institutions that are getting the most funding, that have the most privilege, are in the system and don't have a sincere interest or even orientation, change the system.
That's right.
Then then we're always going to have a problem. Mm-hmm. But maybe I'm naive, or maybe I'm just super hopeful. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think that we can stop people from being hungry.
That
I
is
think we can
correct.
stop people. I
It's
think
not.
we can end poverty.
I
Right?
agree
Like,
with that. It is a doable. I say it all the time. Like we can end hunger. Like ending
right.
hunger is feasible. Like it is
Right.
absolutely. It's not. No, you're not naive. So again, I just thank you for that. Again, bringing that because when we talk about we need to change systems of racism. That's a systemic issue right there. And so thank you for highlighting that for me. Because again, it shapes what we try to work on here as our policy changes that we're trying to affect. So, and then beyond that, again, for our members that's here, know that the center, as we move into this work, we've always used racial justice as a lens for our policy work. So it's good that we clarify, each of our policies that we're trying to take, what does that actually look like? And so that's a key component that you just mentioned, because there is a lot of emphasis on food banks. And so again, I thank you for, again, reframing it for us at the center. So I'm committed to staying connected to the both of you all. Aisha, before we go to closing thoughts, were there any unanswered questions from Facebook or in the chat? Seen a lot of movement in the chat and I haven't been able to keep it up.
There was one, and Duron actually responded to that directly. Thank you for doing that.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. And so with that, wanted to ask if either one of you all had any closing thoughts. I will pub again. We are going to be supporting so that you can look for some information in our weekly newsletter and social media on the Faith, Food, and Freedom Summer Campaign. And you can put on your calendars now, August 28th is the Happily Natural Festival this year. So definitely want us to begin supporting and becoming more involved as we delve into this work. Last thoughts that either one of you all may have, Namita?
Last thoughts are just to get involved with growing food locally. There are usually so many farms near you that you can get involved with. And at our network, we have a Black Farmer Directory. If you want to look up if there are farms in your network, there are always Black farmers who need your support. And there are so many ways you can support, even if going there physically and helping them with labor isn't accessible to you.
And you all know I'm the resource queen here at the center, so I absolutely will be putting together a resource on how to support with direct information with the directory. And our goal is to continue to grow that directory with more farmers here in Virginia. Duron, your last thoughts?
Yeah, I just was going to say that while our work, we center racial justice. I want folks to understand that from our lens, like food justice, climate justice, environmental justice, like all of those things are manifest through the work of racial justice, right? These are all just subsets, right, of that work.
Yeah.
And that it's important for us to equally fixate on like the ecological benefits as much as we fixate on like the food, like the public health benefits, because all these things are intersectional. Yeah. And it's like I can't pull one out and like this other thing is as if this other thing is not happening. So just be mindful that this work of urban agriculture allows for room for everybody to show up with their full selves and their passions on their sleeve. And there's plenty of organizations that you can give your time and energy to, but definitely support Happily Natural Day because we got a lot of stuff going on. From management of spaces to kind of like policy change and training of community folks. So Happily Natural Day is, you can access us at thenaturalfestival.com or look us up on social media. And we look forward to seeing you out in the field. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And again, I feel so good having entered into this space with the both of you all for the first time, for me personally, and then for the center. So I hope those of you all who joined us tonight and those who will listen to this recording as well feel the same way. Thank you for your time, your talent, and absolutely will continue and follow up with you for the conversation as soon as I get my voice back. So nice. You all have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Dora.